Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a new week of Two Chaps Mini Cultures with the Brett and the Christian. And today we're going to talk about sales and marketing across cultures because it's hard enough to get stuff moved to the consumer in your own culture. Now, imagine how hard it will be to do this with the same product or a very similar product to people outside of your native culture. And we have somebody with us here today who's done that for years and can tell a little story, maybe two or three about those. So stay tuned. Hello, world. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing fantastic. Absolutely just wonderful and peachy today. Welcome to the show of the culture of business and the business of culture. This is Two Chaps Mini Cultures episode number 131.
Isn't that the number on the license plate of Donald Duck's car? I don't remember that. I think Donald Duck's car had a license plate, and I think it was 131. But I have to double check. This just came up. This is childhood memories are coming up here.
Now this is important information. I'm going to have to go back and Google.
Yeah. Now everyone. No, don't Google it now. Wait till the end of the episode. Google it later, people. All right. No. So let us know where you're dialing in from. Let us know where you're watching this from. Give us a like. Give us a applause. Give us a boo. Whatever it is you think you need to give us. Let us know where in the world you are. Where you're watching this. Maybe tell us why you're watching this. What brought you here today? What has brought you here throughout these 130 episodes that we've done before? Who knows? We want to know you. We want to find out about you. Because we'll take you on a journey, and not just with Donald Duck's car, but with all sorts of cars. And we have somebody with us today who's been in the car industry for quite a while. And he's been, I don't want to say sell cars. Tim Mahoney, have you sold cars? Were you the person selling the car? Not really, right?
Not really. I mean, but yes, in some ways, right? Trying to create demand for the cars. So.
Welcome to the program, Tim. Thanks for taking time.
Happy to be here. Happy New Year to you guys.
Yes, it still counts. Still January.
Yes. Yeah.
So we announced you a little bit in the preview to this episode, but not everybody is familiar with the automotive industry, and maybe not familiar with you. But you've been I would say, quite prominent figure in the global automotive industry on the marketing side of things. You worked for Porsche, for Volkswagen, for General Motors, and I believe for Subaru, and I'm sure I missed some. So you worked for Germans, Americans, and Japanese. So you've done your trip around the world in marketing vehicles, haven't you?
I have, absolutely. Yeah. I most of my career, the early part of my career, I always was fighting for the away team. But my last role was with General Motors, and was there for about 6.5 years. So it was a great opportunity to see a lot of different cultures, not only across boundaries like country boundaries, but corporate cultures as well. I mean, even within the German sort of universe, the culture between Porsche and VW was a very different culture, right? So it's been a great experience.
Which is interesting, because those of you who are gearheads, you might know that Volkswagen and Porsche belong to, let's say, the big conglomerate, the same conglomerate. Some might even argue they were founded by the same, not person, but the same engineering idea, right? The Ferry Porsche, who both designed the Beetle and the 911 and I think the 356 too, right? He designed the Porsche 3. So, but one based in central northern Germany, Volkswagen, and one in the southwest in Stuttgart, Porsche. Two different corporate identities, two different consumer types, one would argue, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting. When I was with Porsche, I went there in '99 to launch the Cayenne. and for a lot of people that was brand heresy, right? Here's a sports car brand that is launching a crossover SUV, whatever you prefer to call it. But it was a really, really exciting time to be with the brand, and see those sort of differences. So I spent a lot of time, I sort of view Stuttgart as sort of a home away from home. Spent less time in Wolfsburg, fortunately, because it's kind of, I won't say a wasteland, but it's in the middle of nowhere for sure. And in fact, that was in some cases by design when they built.
You mean in Helmstedt, or what do people call Wolfsburg who don't like it? It's they call it by the village that used to be there. What was it?
That very well could be. I know what you're talking about, right? Because it didn't really exist until the 30s, maybe probably early 30s.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting place. I often would stay in Berlin and take the train, actually. So,
well, I'm not
more culture in the capital.
So you just hinted at something. So Porsche, ever since the 1950s, known as one of the probably top three iconic sports car manufacturers. And when I say top three, I'm going to include Ferrari, and maybe we can think of a third one. But Ferrari and Porsche, probably the top two brands that people think of when we're talking sports cars. Everybody in the U.S. remembers James Dean dying in a Porsche that he drove too fast. So that is an icon, right? So, and then they came out with an SUV, and you were there to help launch that. What were from a marketing perspective, what were some of the challenges that you experienced there, and how did German culture flare up for you in that incident?
So, as a student, I lived in Germany, and I studied in Austria, and I thought I understood the culture. What I didn't understand was the business culture, right? Living in a country as a student and being there for over a year, you get a really good sense of it. But the business culture was very, very kind of a different experience. Mm. And I went there was recruited to go in '99. I was with Subaru before, and went there really to launch the Cayenne for them. And the reaction, of course, at the time was a lot of skepticism. I would say maybe other than Mercedes with M-Class and maybe X5 was around the same. Porsche was one of the earlier sort of innovators of moving into that space. But I think what allowed them to do it successfully is that the vehicle itself, even though it was something kind of different from what they had been marketing for probably the 40 years before that, was that it stayed really true to the values of the brand. And what I mean by that is, if you ask Porsche, and perhaps they've changed it since I've been gone, but I don't think so, because when I look at the products, they still embody all that. It really is about great design. It's about great performance. And it's about a level of exclusivity, right? The vehicles at the price point that they're at are really not for everybody, right? And so when you think about launching a Cayenne, could it have the performance that you'd come to expect of a Porsche? Could it have the design? And would it be exclusive? And I think the answer was yes. And it allowed them then to move into this space. And at the time, you have to think back, that a lot of the planning was in the late 90s, and we launched, I think it was 2003-ish, for Cayenne. The vehicle itself, that wasn't a real mature market at the time, right? That was a really sort of maybe early phase of it. And it was a great experience to be part of it, but because they stayed true to what that brand represented, it allowed them then to do others, right? So, the Panamera, which is essentially a four-door sedan, and Macan, and now Taycan, which is the electrified version, or the first entry into. But all of those vehicles, if you lined them all up, you would say, boy, they look really good. So the styling's really great. The performance is world class. And there's a level of brand experience, customer experience that is exclusive and premium.
Now, you said you didn't know German corporate culture. How did that hit you when you first started working for a German corporation? How was that different from the German language world that you had experienced as a student?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, I worked briefly before I went back to grad school, and then I spent my first 15 years, if you will, in my work life working for the Japanese. And the Japanese culture, was very much about keeping your cool, keeping your calm, not, consensus, all the things you read about, of course, in the management books, and in reality, a lot of that is in fact true. But it was a very subtle, I guess you could say, maybe experience working for them and navigating that culture. Whereas the German culture, my experience, which was the first time at Porsche and then subsequently at VW, was like a bad day on the kindergarten playground, right? I mean, it was a lot of arguing and fighting and politics and screaming and whatever. And the minute you would lose your cool with the Japanese, you've lost the battle, right? It was always about being composed, and it was quite normal to be in meetings where you're screaming and hollering at one another. I mean, I don't want to overplay that piece of it, but the reality is it was much more hand to hand. And when I went,
confrontational.
Yeah, confrontational. And when I went for the interview, it was interesting. I had to actually go over and I met with the board member and actually the global head of marketing and stuff like that. And they weren't sure that I would be able to do it because I'm normally a pretty calm person. I'm not. It's not that I'm conflict averse, but I think there's other ways to do it, and probably a lot of that had to do with working for the Japanese for so long. But they were actually quite surprised. And when I actually left the company to actually go back to Subaru in 2006, I got a really lovely note from the board member who said, we used to fight like hell, but it was always for the business and it was never personal. And so that was a really interesting kind of cultural thing, which would be very different in dealing with the Japanese, and even to a certain extent with the Americans. My most recent company, right? If you would get into intense debates about topics with people, quite often here they would take it personally. The Germans didn't take it personally, right? And it never was personal. It was always about the business and the results, and, if you will, the efficiency of and the effectiveness of the decision.
Mm-hmm. You used an interesting term before, Tim, and that's the one of framing it in as playing for the away team, right? Or and it brought me, and both of you guys have books behind. I don't have my books close to me, but if I wish I could grab it, because there's a book called Playing Away, which was written for and by Australian executives, that have had a good level of success, mostly focused in the US. So, but it's always talking about not losing their particular style and of management, and then convincing. It's kind of very arrogant of some of the Australian leadership is to think we can just come in and throw a few g'days around and everybody's going to start writing checks for us, right? And it seems to work at the very top levels, strangely enough, in this country. Aussies can seem to get away with a bit of stuff. But what about for you? When you go and play for another team, this is ostensibly you having to kind of go and learn on the training field very quickly, and sometimes on the playing field, right? So this is it. When you use that term, do you think about it in sporting analogies of trying to work out who's who on the team and who to pass it to at the right time? I don't know whether that's something you've thought of.
It's interesting. There are really, I think, no politics like politics you can encounter at a headquarters level, right? And up until I joined GM. When I said I was sort of with the away team, I was in the markets, right? I was always in a big market for the respective brands, whether that was VW, whether that was Porsche, whether that was Subaru, and so you have a different perspective of things, and I remember really at all three of the import brands thinking, gee, if I just work for the headquarters, I could just make this happen. I could boss these guys around and whatever, and not that I'm a particularly bossy person, but at the end of the day, I'm from the factory, right? I'm from the mothership. And so when I say working for the away team, for me, that was what it was like to be in the markets. In some ways, you were actually more in control of your destiny, I think, than people realize, because they need people from the markets to help the brand interpret what's going to work and what isn't going to work. But then coming to work for GM in their world headquarters here in Detroit, it was another whole eye-opener in terms of what it's like on the other side of the aisle or the other side of the desk, in terms of trying to encourage people in markets to do certain things that were good for the brand, good for the business, but in some cases reported in and had different objectives. And I think that's always where some of these tensions can come into play, whether you're talking across cultures or even within the organization. If your goals don't line up, there's automatically going to be a conflict there that exists.
And I remember, because you and we talked before for a podcast episode that was it launched last year? I don't even remember. Oh, probably 2019 now. But what you just said reminds me of a story you told me about how you made a decision for the Japanese brand for marketing in the US, which Japanese leadership was a little bit concerned about, that you would tell that story about the vehicle, right? And that was the Subaru story that I'm going to let you tell the story, because you're much better at this than I am, where your Japanese superior thought, ooh, that doesn't make us look good, but it's going to serve the US market and maybe we should let him run with it. So tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. And I think the story you're referring to is when I returned to Subaru in 2006 from Porsche. We 1 year later, we were in this transition phase of launching a new platform for the brand here. And it was built around the customers feeling that they had for Subaru, which is they love it. It's interesting. If you talk to a Porsche owner or even a BMW, probably Mercedes, how do you like your car? They're going to tell you they love it, right? You talk to a Toyota buyer or a Honda buyer, oh, it's really dependable, it's nice, and it gets good gas mileage and whatever. But in the case of Subaru, people were always talking about, I love the car, and so there was really a higher level of emotion and a higher level of passion. And so we rolled out, in that sort of initial campaign, a body of work that had 3 commercials. And 2 of them were fine. I mean, in the end of the day, they were actually all fine, but got a very sort of odd reaction from our CEO when I shared it with him. And we were close. I mean, I think that's the other thing. Relationships matter, right? And building relationships with your colleagues, and if you're in an international company, with your peers on the other side of the world, is really important. So there was a trust level there, but I couldn't figure out what the deal was. And the commercial, and all of the commercials that we used to launch the campaign, were based on real things, real stories, if you will. And the one you're speaking of specifically is this place, and I should look, I'm almost positive it's in Wisconsin. It's either Minnesota or Wisconsin, but it's called Subaru Heaven. And it's where people that own Subarus take it's like a cemetery, right? It's where you take your Subaru to die. And we were launching the new Forester, and it was a younger guy, kind of millennial type, if you will. And his buddy was following behind him in his new Subaru, and they were taking this thing off to the great Subaru beyond. And the spot was super good. Made the point about the customer's loyalty to the brand and the commitment and the care they had and how they really loved it and stuff like that. So that was all good. So I had to ask the guy, our chairman, like I said, is a really good friend. I said, what's the deal? And he said, well, it kind of triggers us. He didn't use those words, but that's kind of a very sort of 2020 expression. We sort of triggered them. And the reason was, during the war, when it was apparent that Japan was losing the war, there wasn't enough food, and so a lot of the older people basically starved or committed suicide so that the younger ones could survive. And so this notion of driving up on a mountain, and the one story he told me about was this place where the old people go and they just jump off, not a cliff, but basically a cliff, right? Yeah. So that there was more for that larger community. And so, yeah, that was a kind of interesting one. There was another one too with Porsche, because of the way the Germans and the Europeans write the date. It's always the day first, and then the month. So literally, with the launch of the new 997, our German colleagues wanted to make baseball caps that said 9/11 on them, and I'm like, "Oh, time out, guys! I mean, we're just through this tragedy here in New York at the World Trade Center and whatever." And it took a little bit of sort of maneuvering around to kind of convince them. But I think at the end of the day, it came down to talking and communicating.
And I've had these conversations with expatriates from Germany that come to the US. They're still confused about 9/11 because they also learn, or maybe have read, that, well, the phone number for emergency services in the US is 911. So they equate that with the type of the car and the date, and they say, what's the big deal? You call 911 if you have an emergency. No, you call 911. You don't call 911.
Right.
And those nuances are often lost on people when they first cross cultures, right? So I would suspect that in your career, where you were crossing cultural lines multiple times, that you over time became kind of a translator, interpreter, a cultural interpreter for the companies that you worked for. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think you have to be a good observer, right? You have to listen in sort of the relationship of what God gave us, which is 2 ears and 2 eyes and only one mouth, right? So you have to listen, you have to look, and maybe talk a little bit less, and on top of it, from a relationship standpoint, you need people along the way with a level of trust and mutual respect to kind of help you from stepping into cultural landmines, if you will.
Was that hard for you to be accepted in your role? I mean, you were in the leadership position. You were, I guess, chief marketing officer or an equivalent of that role for many of these global brands. So decision making was largely on your desk, whether the concept for advertising a product would go this direction or that direction. So you were in charge to varying degrees, but oftentimes I would argue the buck stopped with you, especially when it came to the marketing and advertising part of it. Was it hard for you to get the acceptance from your Japanese colleagues or from your German colleagues? And if so, how long did it take you to overcome those pushbacks?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is no, it wasn't too hard, because I think I made an attempt to connect on a sort of very human level with these folks and make it clear that we're there to move the business forward and make the brand stronger, right? I think when people realize that you're just trying to do the right thing, it makes it a lot easier, rather than if, say, you're out there to promote your own personal brand, which a lot of quote unquote rock star CMOs try to do, right? It's all about how much press they can get and stuff like that. So
we're not naming any names here, right? No, okay.
No, I'm not. No naming any.
No CMO shaming.
Yeah, exactly. But I had really good and profound relationships, and it's funny, sort of back to the German example, the marketing director at the time at Porsche centrally in Stuttgart, he and I fought like dogs. And I think the other markets in some ways kind of enjoyed it. It was like sport, right? But at the end of the day, we're still friends, and I'm still, I'm in touch with him. And when I was with GM, and he went on to be global CMO for Jaguar Land Rover, and so I was in UK, and I invited him to Manchester, even though he doesn't really like EPL, but we had fun a couple of years ago. So the relationship piece is really important, and I think when you look into another culture. This was something which I believe, so he didn't necessarily have to tell me, but it crystallized the idea that when you look at another culture, it's not good or bad, it's just different. And you have to try and understand why it's different, and why it may not necessarily align with your value systems or how you see problems or whatever. But at the end of the day, that's what makes things interesting, right? If you can observe that and operate in it and move forward.
Now, Brett and I, we did an episode last week, right, Brett, about cars and cultural identities. Brett, remind us what were we talking about?
Yeah, it was browsing, and it's back in episode 123, not that long ago, just the week before last, and it was after I had accidentally stumbled across a mini series where a particular celebrity and had gone to Germany and Italy and France and driven a set of cars, and I guess maybe not intentionally, but intentionally gave us a lesson in culture, in how those cars reflected the values and basically the heart and soul of the countries where they were designed in. 3 countries that are ostensibly neighbors to each other, right? They're very, very close. But, for those of us that have driven across those borders, we know they're very different. And so I thought that was a fascinating thing. So we did that episode just to reflect on our observations of that. Now, you've lived it, Tim, so it's an interesting thing for me to hear what your perspective would be. And also, just to add something I was thinking of before, do you think it's an advantage as an outsider to be able to make the home culture see the limits of their own observation or understanding of their own culture? That and to get beyond and think outside of the box of that particular lane, or let's call it in racing terms, car racing terms.
Yeah. No, great. I mean, it's a great question, and yes, I think it. Having an outside perspective it eliminates some of the blind spots that the home market might have, right? We all have our own blind spots, and so if you're coming from a different place, you're obviously going to see things differently. But the only way that's of value is if you have the trust and confidence of the partner on the other side of the ocean, and sometimes that takes longer. Japanese for sure takes a long time, right? I mean, and the fact that I actually went back to a Japanese company is pretty unusual, right? Quite often, when you would leave, it's almost like you died, right? You don't even talk about that person anymore because they left us. But I was there 15 years and then for 5 more, so 20 in total. But it is. You really have to have those sort of relationships to be able to help them see things that they can't see. And interestingly enough, the Japanese versus the Germans, and this is really dangerous too when you're talking about cultures, because if you make a statement, it's like a fact, and I don't mean it that way, but there is some truth to it. The Japanese culture is so far different than US culture, or even maybe you could say Western culture, right? And so in some ways they were actually easier to work with because they realized that they were so different than us, and that they really needed people to help them navigate the sort of the cultural landscape, the market landscape easier. The European brands, like my ancestors are German, or at least a big part of them are German. we all kind of look alike. We all came from came to the same place. And so a lot of, and again, generalization, the Germans figured, we got this all figured out, right? We'll just tell you what to do from Stuttgart. We'll tell you what to do from Wolfsburg, and you'll just do it, right? Because we know. But in reality,
we know better.
We know better. We absolutely know. One of the funniest things was that the Detroit Auto Show is a German story. We probably should talk more broad-based than just the Germans, but it's an area that I love and know really well. They had us bring sausages back so that we could find ones that would sort of be up to their standards, right? So the board members wanted Weisswurst in the morning for breakfast with the right mustard and, of course, the pretzels, and we had to have Warsteiner beer and whatever. But also
the Detroit Motor Show.
At the Detroit Motor Show, yeah, for sure, because the companies would build extravagant board-level dining facilities into their auto show displays that would only be used for 2 days during press day, and then it essentially, it was shut down. But I'll never forget this colleague of mine came back with essentially a little baggie with 2 little white sausages in them, and it's like, they said we have to have these, and I'm like, yeah, okay, we've got this.
Gosh.
So.
Well, and a lot of people may not know this, but Volkswagen has a sausage making division. They actually make more sausages than they make cars, and I think the sausage itself has a part number in the Volkswagen universe, so it's tracked. It doesn't get any more German than that.
Kristen, you could probably find it and even post it on your site. I found a video on YouTube where they're basically, they go into the kitchen of Wolfsburg where the chef is there, and it's all about currywurst and the sausages that they make there and the number that they make. It's a pretty funny story.
And we talked about this before, Tim. My father was a butcher in his active days, and he tried the Volkswagen sausage. And even though my dad's from southern, or my whole family's from southern Germany, and Wolfsburg is from up north, all those regional differences. So he tried that. He said, actually, that sausage is legit. Wouldn't have thought it, but it is actually decent, right?
It's pretty good. It's not my favorite, but it's pretty good.
Now, but back to Brett's question, do you think that the cars a country makes are reflective of their cultures in general, or is this too far of a stretch?
No, I think to a certain extent that's true. If you look at the cars that we produce here in the U.S., it's changing, of course, but they used to be big old cruiser, marshmallowy kind of, get in it and drive down I-95 to Florida for the winter months. Germany, on the other hand, which is, I think, now more myth than reality, is the land of the Autobahn. And so if you're engineering a car that can go to the level of speeds that you're allowed to drive at over there, it's a different kind of driving experience, and there's a difference, I guess you would say, feel to it. I mean, even at a simplistic level, this was a cultural interesting thing early on. Trying to get the Germans to put cup holders in the car was like, I don't know what kind of comparison to make, but it was next to impossible, because the German attitude is, you're there to drive. You're not there to eat. You Americans have picnics in your car, and you've got Cheerios and goldfish crackers, and you should be paying attention to the road. So I would say that's true. I think when you look at the design and the feel of some of the Italian cars, particularly some of the Fiat stuff like Multicultural, which is just this really crazy van that they had years and years ago, some really sort of interesting, very interesting, but also some very, very sort of strange looking vehicles in the French, probably somewhere in between. So I think, yeah. Now it'll be interesting to see. I think the board has just approved the merger of Fiat Chrysler and PSA. So, the number of brands and the number of holding companies is shrinking at some levels, but there are definitely characteristics that I think either seep through the air or seep through the minds of the engineers and find their way into the sheet metal at the end of the day.
Brett, I saw you posted something. It says, what?
I looked it up, and it says the VW that smells nothing like a car, right? There is short Bloomberg story that that I posted there, and it's probably one of the many on YouTube. But it's and in that show that we reference, Tim is Paul Hollywood, because he's a baker, and I guess his connection to the kitchen is something. He sits in a combi van before he goes to bed and eats one of the sausages. It's quite.
I have to look that up. I mean, even though all I've done is watch content for the past 9 months, I know there's still a lot that I haven't seen.
There you go.
I'll send it through to you. Yeah, and they do reference that story about not eating in the car, right? In France, for example, you know, like because it's so driven by cuisine, the car is just a vehicle to get you to the next best meal. That's the only way to do it, right? And it can look silly, and it can not be functional. It can be wacky, but it can get you to the next best meal. Yeah.
My German friends and family, when they come visit and see the way, I mean, I still drive quite German, quote unquote. I have not succumbed to the American way of driving 100%. However, my German friends and family, they lose their marbles when they see what's going on in the center console of our car. Like, keep both hands on the wheel. Well, what are you doing? And so it's no joke, Tim. Tim is totally right. Now,
you know, it drives me nuts here, and this is something I wish we would ticket people for, because they definitely do in Germany. It drives me nuts when people pass on the right here on the highways, right? I mean, over there, I can't speak as much. I have driven in France and in Spain and Italy, but I've spent a lot of time in Germany. But you dare not pass on the right-hand side on the Autobahn, right? The left lane is for overtaking and getting back in. Here, you're going down the road, and it's literally like, it's the only place was worse I ever drove was in India, right? And then there was like literally lane lines, and there's just cars everywhere.
Now, I have an automotive question that I don't know if you feel confident to respond to, or whether you think that that's within your wheelhouse or not. But for us, like for people like Brett and myself, who we've been working in the cross-cultural management field for many, many years, and the automotive industry, because of its global interconnectedness, for decades has been often a poster child for case studies, like how to do it or how not to do it. And one of the poster boys for competent global management was an automotive manager, Carlos Ghosn, Brazilian, French, Lebanese, who successfully managed the Nissan-Renault alliance for many, many years, and all of a sudden fell from graces, especially in Japan. Is that something that came as a surprise to the automotive field for somebody like you who's been in that arena for so long? Or are these idols that we may create for ourselves? Look at this person, they are doing it right in terms of global management. Is this too dangerous to put people on that kind of pedestal?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you put somebody at that level, eventually the hubris, the arrogance will start to overtake them. But it is definitely a category where you have big personalities, not just Carlos Ghosn, but I mean, on the German brands as well, right? The Winterkorns and the Wiedeking. I mean, Wiedeking made a fortune at Porsche, and I think now he's running a pizza place
which isn't doing so well, by the way.
Right? Yeah, but I think they're all sort of larger than life personalities, and it's a funny category, and I think it'll be interesting to see and I won't see it, just because chronologically I'm not going to last that long, but over the next 50 years or so, as transportation starts to change and vehicles become more electrified and autonomy, starts to change. But I forget who it's a German saying, Kleider machen Leute. It's not just clothes, right? It's cars too, right? And they define the person. And I noticed this for sure when I joined Porsche, and I went out the first night I had my new 911 to the restaurant, and people treated me differently, right?
Yeah,
So the leaders of these companies, in some ways, kind of believe their own bullshit, right? And it can in fact get them into trouble. And I think this is where brands can falter either through arrogance or complacency. I think those are the two kind of big derailers for companies that prevent them from lasting, or certainly having sort of peaks and valleys. So, yeah, the short answer is it didn't surprise me with him. And Sergio was another one. He passed away.
Sergio Marchionne, yeah.
I was going to ask you about him because that's another one. Yeah.
I mean, there's hundreds of them, right? I think the industry, probably more than others, tends to breed them. I think Mary Barra is a different animal. She's a really good, kind person, right? And it's interesting.
That's the CEO of General Motors, right?
Yeah, exactly. And sort of the first woman really to lead a major, or really any, I guess, auto company. It's a class act, but some of them have egos that barely fit into the room.
Yeah. Just like me and Christian, we don't fit into the camera.
Well,
we're just too full of ourselves. That's why.
I've been battling because this is what I've learned over these 131 episodes is I have to be ready to think on my feet, and how do we close it off? And I have two closing thought ideas that I couldn't reconcile while you were talking. One, I want to ask you, what would be, after your successful career as a global executive, what would be your top advice for anyone entering into a global position? What is it that nobody will tell them in school or in the management course that you would like to tell them? I think, that's one. And I have one more question after that, but that's something that I'd be very curious of.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you have an opportunity to work across cultures, work globally, interact with people that have a different point of view, a different background than you, go for it, right? Because it is such a rewarding experience to interact with people from around the world and see things from different perspectives. I think as people, it makes us richer and bigger, and in some cases better. And I to my comment maybe earlier when we were talking just a few minutes ago, I do think it's important to listen and to look and not to talk too much, and because you can talk over or at people, or you can talk to people, and sometimes we tend to overlay our home culture prejudices and things, and yet it's really exciting actually to see a different point of view. And so I feel very fortunate. My assistant at GM laughed at me. She says, "I think you know somebody in every country around the world." And I said, "Well, I don't know about every country," but she was always amazed that I'm talking to so-and-so here and whatever. And for me, this has made for really a wonderful journey over the past 35, 40 years.
That might be the biggest badge of honor you could have, to actually know somebody anywhere.
I love it, right? And friends will say, "Hey, what about this city?" And I say, "Well, I don't know, but I know somebody I could, reach out to." And it's like a global network in some weird way.
Yeah. Nice. Now, I have one more thing that I need to ask you, because I know you and we've been talking about this, and we already talked about sausages. For those of you who don't know, Tim does a lot of things, and he also has a culinary interest. So here's Tim when he's chefing or making sausages, or how's that been going, Tim? Tell us about that real quick.
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit before. I love it. I mean, it makes me super happy. But I've sort of dialed back the sausage making during the pandemic because I don't have the distribution, that I did before. Like when I was in the office and I could, get out and talk with. That said, I've gone through multiple phases of COVID, from bread baking to ice cream making. Tonight it's Cuban food. It's a Cuban pork roast, like you saw in the movie Chef. So,
yes, please.
Yeah, and it smells amazing. It's been marinating since yesterday. So when I get off, I'm gonna drop it into the oven. do some black beans and rice and plantains. But I still like it, and I still enjoy sausage making. I was so excited this past summer. A local beer hall opened in the market area of Detroit, and so I was a little bit like Norm on Cheers. I was there every Tuesday and Thursday, but they need better sausage.
And they all know your name, right? Just
totally.
Like
absolutely, and what I drink.
By the way, in terms of distribution, Brett and I will send you our mailing addresses, and maybe we'll send you a cooler that we can send back and forth. I can help you out with the distribution. I'll take some of that stuff.
I have shipped some to friends in New York. I especially the dry cured sausage, right? Sort of like the salamis and things like that, vacuum packed. The fresh ones are tougher, right? They're just, it's even if you freeze them. But yeah, I'll have to try and get you some.
Excellent.
Good.
Tim, thanks so much for taking time for us. Stay safe, cook well. Good luck with that Cuban pork roast. I'm kind of jealous. Well, maybe I can. How long is that going to be in the oven? How far is Detroit? I'm not sure.
I think Tom is ready when you are. So, and there's probably nobody flying, so you should probably help them out.
All right,
guys. Thanks a lot. Happy New Year to you both.
Thank you, Tim, and congratulations on all your success over the last 35 and 40 years. There's probably, beside the people you've probably touched many others in your in the way that you've passed on your knowledge in this world, and I guess it'll be a much better world for it, the way you've managed and been and had your success. So that is worth mentioning in and of itself, and encouraging anybody that wants to go into a more global role. You do have an effect on people's lives, so that's great.
Good, guys. All right, stay safe, and I'll see you sometime with sausage.
With sausage.
Bye-bye.
See y'all. See you again tomorrow.